The holiday lights shimmered against the towering glass windows of the city's tallest skyscraper. Inside a lavish, dimly lit office, Billionaire CEO Richard Caldwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing reports, his mind occupied with numbers, deals, and profits. The world knew him as a ruthless businessman, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. But tonight, his world was about to be shaken by a voice he never expected to hear. Just outside the office, a small boy stood nervously at the reception desk. His clothes were slightly worn, his sneakers scuffed, but his bright eyes held a determination far beyond his years. He clutched the sleeve of his mother's coat, his fingers tightening around the fabric as he whispered, "Mom, are you sure? This is him." His mother, Claire, hesitated, her gaze fixed on the nameplate beside the grand office doors. Richard Caldwell. The name alone sent a chill through her, a name she had once known too well, a name she had tried to forget. The receptionist looked down at the boy, and then up at Claire, her expression skeptical. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice polished and professional. Claire straightened her shoulders. "No," she admitted, forcing confidence into her tone. "But my son needs to speak with Mr. Caldwell." The receptionist sighed, glancing toward the office doors. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Caldwell doesn't take walk-ins. You'll need to schedule." Before she could finish, the boy took a bold step forward and called out in a voice louder than anyone expected, "Hey, sir, my mom told me you abandoned us." The room fell silent. The soft hum of the city outside, the murmured conversations from other employees, all of it faded into nothing. Claire's breath caught, her heart pounding, as Richard's head snapped up from his papers. For the first time in years, their eyes met. For a split second, something flashed in his gaze. Shock, disbelief, maybe even recognition. But it was gone just as fast, replaced by a cold, unreadable expression. He pushed back his chair and rose to his feet, smoothing his tailored suit as he studied the boy standing before him. "Who are you?" Richard's voice was measured, but there was an edge to it. The boy lifted his chin, unafraid. "I'm Timmy, and my mom says you're my dad." A slow hush spread across the office. Even the receptionist, who had been reaching for her phone to call security, froze. Richard exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his desk. This was impossible. A child? His child. He had spent years crafting the perfect life, untouchable and pristine. He had buried the past, locked it away like an old file shoved in a forgotten cabinet. And yet, here it was, standing right in front of him with wide, expectant eyes. Claire watched him carefully, waiting for some sign, any sign, that he felt even a fraction of the emotions stirring inside her. But his face remained impassive, his eyes cold and distant, just like the last time she had seen him. Richard let out a slow breath, his voice steady. There must be some mistake, but Timmy wasn't having it. "That's what you're gonna say?" His voice wavered just slightly, his small hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You're just gonna pretend we don't exist." Claire reached for Timmy's hand, but he pulled away, his eyes locked onto Richard's. "My mom never wanted to tell me," he continued, his voice softer now. "She said you were busy, important, but I don't care about all that. I just want to know why." The weight of the question hung in the air. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind raced, grasping for logic, for explanations, for a way to shut this all down before it spiraled any further. He could deny it, call security, walk away, but something in the boy's face held him there, something eerily familiar. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Claire finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "We're not here to ruin your life, Richard. We're not here for money or publicity. Timmy just wanted to see you, to understand." Richard looked at her then, really looked at her. The years had changed her, but there was still that same fire in her eyes, the same resilience he had once admired, and for the first time in years, the walls he had so carefully built around himself wavered. He had spent a lifetime making decisions based on logic, on control, but standing before him was the one thing he couldn't control, the truth, and it wasn't going away. Richard's grip tightened around the edge of his desk. His mind screamed for him to take control of the situation, to dismiss this as some misunderstanding. But the weight of Timmy's stare held him in place. He could see it now, the resemblance, the sharpness in his eyes, the curve of his jaw. The boy wasn't lying, and neither was Claire. A part of him wanted to turn away, to shut them out like he had years ago. But another part, buried deep beneath layers of power and prestige, felt something else. Guilt, regret, he couldn't tell. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her fingers brushing against Timmy's back, a silent reassurance. She hadn't come here to stir up old wounds, but the boy had questions. Questions she couldn't answer for him. Only Richard could. And now, standing before the man who had once meant everything to her, she realized that the weight of the past was heavier than she'd expected. Timmy's voice broke the silence again. "Mom told me you used to be different." His expression was unreadable, but there was something raw beneath it. Hope, maybe. "She said you weren't always rich, that you used to care." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. The memories were sudden, uninvited. A cramped apartment, late nights spent dreaming of a future he was determined to build. Claire beside him, believing in him even when he barely believed in himself. He had promised her the world, and then he had left it all behind. His voice was colder than he intended when he finally spoke. "That was a long time ago." Timmy frowned. "So what? That means we don't matter?" Claire inhaled sharply, ready to step in, but Richard held up a hand. His eyes locked onto Timmy's, the intensity in them unshakable. "You don't understand how life works, kid. Sometimes we make choices because we have to." The boy narrowed his eyes. "No, you make choices because you want to." The room was too quiet now, the tension almost unbearable. Even the receptionist had retreated to her desk, pretending not to listen. Claire finally spoke, her voice softer this time. "I never wanted to bring him here like this, Richard. But he's old enough to ask questions now, and I won't lie to him." She swallowed. "He deserved to hear it from you." Richard looked at her then, and for the first time in years, he saw her as she once was, not just a woman from his past, but someone he had loved, someone who had trusted him, and he had broken that trust in ways he had never cared to admit. He exhaled, running a hand through his neatly styled hair, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Claire?" His voice trailed off, the weight of everything pressing down on him. She gave him a sad smile. "I don't need an apology. Not for me. But he does." Timmy's gaze didn't waver. "So why did you leave?" Richard hesitated. The truth wasn't simple. It never was. He had convinced himself back then that leaving was the right choice, that success required sacrifice, that he had done what needed to be done. But standing here now, with the boy staring up at him, waiting for an answer, it didn't feel like the right choice anymore. It felt like a mistake. "I thought I was doing what was best," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I thought, if I made it big, nothing else would matter." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Turns out I was wrong." Timmy blinked, as if trying to process the words. You were wrong? Richard nodded slowly. Yeah, I was. Claire studied him carefully, not sure if she believed him. She had spent years trying to forget him, trying to push away the anger, the hurt. But seeing him now, she realized something. He wasn't the same man he had been when he left. He looked successful, powerful, in control. And yet, in this moment, he looked just as lost as he had all those years ago. Timmy shifted on his feet. So, what happens now? The question hung in the air. Richard didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what the next step was. He had spent years building walls around himself, keeping people out, believing that loneliness was the price of greatness. But now, with his past staring him in the face, he wasn't sure if that was the life he wanted anymore. Claire sighed. That's up to you, Richard. And with that, she took Timmy's hand, turning toward the door. The moment was slipping away, the choice left hanging in the space between them. Richard watched them go, a strange, unfamiliar ache settling in his chest. For years, he had thought his past was buried, but now it had come knocking, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to shut the door. Richard stood frozen for a moment, watching Claire and Timmy walk toward the door. The words hung heavy in the air, and he felt his chest tighten with regret. There was so much he wanted to say, so much that had remained unsaid for all these years. But when it came to the people he once cared about most, his pride had always been louder than his heart. Until now. He glanced at the door, then at his reflection in the glass window of his office. The man staring back at him was unrecognizable. He had built an empire from the ground up, yet he had lost what truly mattered, his family. He had pushed them away for the sake of success, but now success felt hollow, empty. Suddenly he moved without thinking. He left his desk, his shoes clicking on the marble floor as he quickly caught up to Claire and Timmy. They were almost out of the building when he called out, "Wait!" Claire paused, her back still turned, but she didn't say anything. Timmy, standing beside her, tilted his head up, his small eyes full of curiosity. Richard swallowed hard, his words struggling to come together. I can't change the past. I know I can't fix everything, but I can start now. I want to try. Claire turned to face him, her expression guarded. And how exactly do you plan on doing that, Richard? You can't just undo years of hurt. With a few words, Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her skepticism. I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I know it's going to take time, but I don't want to be the man I was anymore. I don't want to keep living in this perfect world I created, where I've pushed everyone away. He turned his gaze to Timmy, who was watching him intently. I want to be here for you, Timmy. I want to make things right if you'll let me. There was a long pause. The silence between them was thick with uncertainty, but something shifted in Claire's eyes. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice, or maybe it was the realization that Richard wasn't the same man he had been. Finally, Claire sighed, the weight of everything they had gone through settling between them. It's not going to be easy, Richard, but I'm willing to give you a chance. For Timmy's sake. Timmy looked up at his mother, then back at Richard, his face softening just slightly. So, you're not going to leave again? Richard's heart clenched. The question was simple, but it carried years of abandonment and pain. He knelt down in front of Timmy, looking him in the eye. I'm not going anywhere, kid. I promise. For the first time in years, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe, just maybe, he could still build something real, something that wasn't measured in dollars or power. It was never too late to change, to heal, to rebuild. As Claire and Timmy turned to leave, Richard watched them go, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The door closed behind them, but this time, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. As the days passed, Richard kept his promise. He spent time with Timmy, learning to be a father in ways he hadn't known how to be before. He didn't try to rush the process, but instead let it unfold naturally, step by step. Claire, too, allowed herself to trust him again, slowly but surely. She saw the change in him, the effort he was putting in, and that made all the difference. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he was truly living. The business world remained demanding, but he no longer let it define him. His priorities had shifted. Family, love, connection, that was what mattered now. As the months went by, Richard, Claire, and Timmy created new memories together. The bond they had once shared, fractured by time and regret, was slowly mended, and though the past would always be a part of them, it no longer controlled their future. In the end, it wasn't the success, the wealth, or the power that mattered most. It was the love they found again, the second chances they gave each other, and the lessons they learned along the way. And as Richard watched Timmy laugh with Claire one evening, he realized that the biggest risk he had ever taken wasn't in the boardroom. It was in opening his heart again, and that, more than anything, was the greatest success he could have ever achieved. The story may have started with a little boy asking a tough question, but it ended with a family reunited, stronger than ever. And Richard knew, as he looked at them, that some stories were worth rewriting.